The letter was 3 sentences long. Derek Voss read it 4 times before he understood it was real. Everything you think you inherited, you did not earn. Ask Priya to show you the footage, then decide who you want to be. That was it. No, my darling son. No, I love you. Just a warning, written in his dead mother's shaking handwriting, sealed in an envelope that had been sitting in a lawyer's safe for 6 weeks, since the day she stopped breathing. Derek stood in the marble lobby of Voss Tower, the building with his family name carved into granite above the door, and for the first time in his adult life, his hands would not stop shaking. Behind him, 40 people were setting up chairs for the memorial reception. Flowers everywhere. His mother's photograph, young, smiling, before the cancer, before the wheelchair, before any of this, blown up 8 feet tall on an easel by the window. Everyone in that room thought they knew how this story ended. Rich woman dies. Only son inherits everything. Life goes on. They did not know about the footage. They did not know that 6 months before she died, Eleanor Voss had quietly rebuilt her entire estate plan around a night shift hospice aide named Mara Delgado, a woman Derek had spoken to maybe 11 times in his life, and every single time, he had spoken down to her. They did not know that a lawyer named Priya Chen had a lock drive on her laptop containing 18 hours of security footage that told the real story of the last year of Eleanor Voss's life. A story about a lost wallet, a stranger at a pharmacy, an unlocked drawer of cash, and a woman lying about her identity in a hospice bed, just to see what her own family would do when they thought nobody was watching. Derek folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket, right over his heart, where it suddenly felt very heavy. Mr. Voss? Priya was standing in the doorway, holding a laptop against her chest like a shield. Her face was doing something careful and controlled, the face of a lawyer who has known a secret for a very long time, and has finally run out of reasons to keep it. Your mother left instructions she wants everyone to see something today, before the will is read. Derek looked past her, out at the crowded room, at his mother's enormous smiling photograph. See what? He asked. Priya didn't answer right away. You should sit down, she said. This is going to take a while to understand. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. Mara Delgado had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 11 years. She worked the overnight shift at Riverside Hospice because the night shift paid $2.50 more an hour and nobody else wanted it, and $2.50 an hour was the difference between paying her mother's medication bill and not paying it. She was 29 years old. She had wanted to be a nurse once, a real one, with a degree and a badge that said RN instead of one that said Certified Nursing Assistant. She had gotten through 2 semesters before her mother's diabetes turned into something worse, and the money for school became the money for insulin, and that was simply how it was. Mara did not talk about the nursing degree anymore. She had folded that dream up small enough to fit somewhere she didn't look at very often. What she did instead was walk the same dim hospital corridor every night from 11 to 7, checking on people who were, in one way or another, dying. She adjusted pillows. She held hands that nobody else came to hold. She learned the names of grandchildren who never visited, and repeated those names back to patients so they'd feel, for a moment, less alone. She had been yelled at, cried on, thanked, forgotten, and, once, spat at by a confused patient who thought she was someone from his past. She never once made a patient feel like a burden. She was, by every meaningful measure, poor. Her apartment had a leak in the ceiling above the stove that the landlord had promised to fix for 8 months. She ate the same 3 meals on rotation because they were cheap and filling. She had not bought herself new shoes in 2 years. But there was one thing about Mara that no test, no camera, no stage stranger with a fake declined credit card could manufacture, because it wasn't a performance. When she found money that wasn't hers, she gave it back. When someone needed help and there was no one watching and no reward coming, she helped anyway. It wasn't a virtue she practiced. It was simply who she was, the way some people are naturally left-handed, or naturally afraid of heights. She had never once, in 11 years of walking past unlocked drawers and unattended purses, and people too sick to notice what was missing, take in anything that wasn't hers. She did not know that this fact about her, the quietest, most private fact about her, was about to be tested more thoroughly than any job interview or background check ever could. On the night everything began, Mara was assigned a new patient. Room 214. An elderly woman, recently admitted, terminal difficult family situation, the intake notes said, in the careful, vague language hospitals use when they mean the family barely visits. The woman's name, according to the chart, was Eleanor. Mara had no idea that the last name on that chart was Voss. She had no idea that this frail woman with sharp, watchful eyes owned 12 buildings in the city, including the one Mara sometimes walked past on her way to the bus stop and thought, imagine having that much money. All Mara saw, walking into room 214 for the first time, was a tired old woman who looked like she hadn't been asked a real question in a very long time. Can I get you anything? Mara asked. The old woman studied her for a long moment, the way you'd study a stranger you suspected you might need to remember later. Just talk to me, Eleanor said. Nobody talks to me anymore, they just check boxes. Mara smiled and pulled up a chair. She had no idea she had just failed to check a box and pass the first test of her life. To understand why Eleanor Voss spent the last year of her life lying to almost everyone she loved, you have to understand what was taken from her 40 years earlier, because everything she did in that hospital bed, every staged wallet and hidden camera and quiet test, traced back to one afternoon in a lawyer's office when she was 38 years old, and freshly widowed. Eleanor had married young to a man named Walter Voss, a shipping yard foreman with big hands and bigger plans. Together they had built something out of nothing. First one warehouse, then a fleet of trucks, then a company, then an empire nobody in their working-class families had ever imagined possible. Eleanor was not a decoration in that marriage. She kept the books herself. She caught the accounting errors nobody else noticed. She was, by trade and temperament, a forensic mind long before she had the money to hire people to be one for her. Walter died suddenly of a heart attack at 51. And in the chaos of grief, Eleanor made one mistake she would spend the rest of her life correcting. She trusted her husband's younger cousin, a smiling, generous-seeming man named Robert, to help settle the estate. Robert brought her coffee every morning that terrible month. Robert cried at the funeral louder than anyone. Robert told her, again and again, that he only wanted to make sure she and her son were taken care of. It took Eleanor 3 years to discover that Robert had quietly falsified transfer documents and moved 11% of the company's shipping contracts into holding companies with his own name buried 3 layers deep. By the time she found it, buried in ledgers only she had the patience and the training to actually read line by line, the money was gone, spent, laundered into real estate Robert had already sold. He never went to prison, there wasn't enough left to prosecute meaningfully, and Eleanor, exhausted and grieving and raising a young son alone, didn't have the strength for a decade-long legal war. What she learned instead, and never forgot, was this: the people who passed every visible test of kindness, the ones who cried the loudest and hugged the longest and said all the right things in front of a room full of witnesses, were sometimes exactly the people who would take everything the moment nobody was looking. She raised her son, Derek, alone after that. She built the company into something 10 times larger than what Walter left behind. She never remarried. And somewhere in the process of surviving betrayal, she became someone who watched people the way she'd once watched ledgers, for the one number that didn't add up. By the time she was 78 and dying of the same cancer that had taken her own mother, Eleanor Voss had one unfinished piece of business left in the world, and it was not her fortune, it was her son. She loved Derek. That part was never in question. Not for one single day, no matter what came later. But she had watched him grow into a man who was charming in every room with a camera in it, and something colder in every room without one, and she could not, in good conscience, hand a lifetime's worth of hard-won money to someone without knowing, really knowing, not hoping, not assuming, who he actually was underneath the performance. So she did the only thing a forensic mind knows how to do when it doesn't trust the numbers on the surface. She decided to audit her own son. And because she needed a control, someone to test the same scenarios against, Someone whose reactions would tell her what a real, uncoached, unrewarded kind of goodness actually looked like. She needed a second subject. Someone who had no idea she was rich. Someone with nothing to gain by performing. That was how Eleanor Voss ended up, disguised in a hospice bed under a plain first name, quietly studying the night shift aide who talked to her instead of checking boxes. Derek Voss was, in almost every photograph, smiling. He smiled at the charity galas his mother's company sponsored. He smiled in the magazine profile that called him the next generation of Voss Group leadership. He smiled in the pharmacy parking lot the day he filmed himself offering to look into resources for a struggling stranger. An offer that cost him nothing, that he never followed up on, but that earned him 4,000 likes, and a comment from his mother's old friend calling him such a good boy, just like his father. Derek was 34 years old, and he had never, not once in his adult life, needed to worry about money in a way that changed his behavior. He had grown up in the shadow of a company he did not build, with a name on the building that he had not earned, and somewhere in that shadow, he had developed a very particular skill, the ability to say the right thing in front of the right people at exactly the right moment. It started small, the way these things always do. A borrowed $20 from a college roommate that was never paid back, waved off as, "I'll get you next time." A phrase that became a kind of quiet joke among people who knew him well enough to stop expecting the money back. A habit of taking credit in meetings for ideas that junior staff had actually developed, delivered with just enough charm that the junior staff usually decided it wasn't worth the fight. A pattern, not cruel, not yet, just careless, of treating service staff, drivers, assistants, and aides as furniture that occasionally needed a polite word tossed in its direction. His mother noticed these small things for years before she ever said anything. A foreman's widow does not miss the details. She noticed the way Derek's voice changed when he spoke to a waiter versus a donor. She noticed that he called his personal assistant, the intern, for 2 full years after she'd been promoted, simply because he'd never bothered to learn her actual title. She noticed that when he found money, a return deposit, an overpayment in his favor at a restaurant, a decimal point error on an invoice, he pocketed it without a second thought. The same reflexive way some people say, "bless you," after a stranger's sneeze. None of this made Derek a monster. That was in some ways the hardest part for Eleanor to sit with. Her son was not cruel in any dramatic, easily condemned way. He didn't scream, he didn't hit, he gave generously to causes that made him look good and photographed beautifully. If you asked anyone at that memorial reception whether Derek Voss was a good man, nearly all of them would have said yes, without hesitation. But Eleanor had learned, 40 years earlier, in a lawyer's office with a betrayal she never fully recovered from, that the question was never does this person perform kindness well. The question was, what does this person do in the one room with no mirror in it? She did not yet know the answer for her own son, and that not knowing, more than the cancer eating through her body, was the thing that kept Eleanor Voss awake at 3 a.m, running numbers in her head the way she used to run ledgers, trying to find the discrepancy before it was too late to correct it. It began, as these things often do, with something small enough to seem like nothing. A wallet, left on a cafeteria table at Riverside Hospice on a Tuesday afternoon. Inside it, $340 in cash, an expired gym card, and a photograph of a woman who did not exist, cut from a stock photo catalog and aged with a filter so it would pass a casual glance. Eleanor had prepared it herself 3 days earlier, with the same care she once used to prepare quarterly reports for board meetings. She had not expected a hospital janitor to nearly find it first. For a woman who had spent 40 years controlling variables in boardrooms, this small failure, the fact that she could not fully control a hospital cafeteria, rattled her more than she wanted to admit. She'd had to shuffle back in her wheelchair, feign dropping a napkin, and retrieve the wallet herself before quietly repositioning it exactly where Mara's shift would carry her. Mara found it 40 minutes later. She did not hesitate. She counted the cash out loud, in front of a coworker, so there would be a witness to exactly how much was there, a habit she'd developed years earlier, after her own mother had once been wrongly accused of taking money from a register she'd only ever guarded. Mara turned the wallet in to hospital security within the hour, cash untouched, and never mentioned it again. Eleanor watched this unfold from a hallway camera she had access to through her seat on the hospital's board, a detail almost no one in her family knew about, and one that would matter far more later than it did that day. Watching Mara's small, unremarkable honesty, Eleanor felt something twist in her chest that had nothing to do with the tumor. Derek's version of the same test happened 2 days later with a second wallet, smaller, less cash, $80 instead of $340, a hedge Eleanor had built in without fully admitting to herself why Derek found it in the parking structure near his mother's office. He pocketed $40 of it as a finder's fee, a phrase he actually said out loud to himself in an empty elevator, rationalizing it the way people do when a decision feels too small to examine closely. That night, at a family dinner Eleanor had specifically arranged, Derek mentioned, unprompted, completely unnecessary to the conversation, that he'd returned a wallet he found earlier that week. A full, detailed, warm-sounding lie, offered without anyone asking, about an event that had happened in the opposite direction of how he described it. Eleanor smiled and changed the subject. But something in her went quiet and cold that night. The particular quiet of a forensic accountant who has just found the first line item that doesn't match the ledger. It would have been easy, reasonable even, to stop there, to simply write her son a smaller check, adjust the trust documents, and let the family story continue the way families let uncomfortable things continue, unspoken, unresolved, papered over with holiday dinners and birthday cards. Instead, Eleanor called Priya Chen into her office that same week, and said 4 words that would set the next year of both their lives in motion. "I need more tests." Priya, who at that point believed she was simply helping an aging client update some minor estate paperwork, had no idea what she was agreeing to. She would later describe that meeting as the moment she stopped being Eleanor Voss's lawyer and started being something closer to a co-conspirator in the most elaborate, most personal audit either of them had ever conducted. What none of them knew yet, not Eleanor, not Priya, not Derek, and certainly not Mara, was that Eleanor's careful, controlled experiment had already sprung its first uncontrolled variable. Ruth, Eleanor's longtime assistant, had been quietly watching the whole wallet exchange unfold too. And Ruth, unlike her employer, had opinions of her own about where all this testing was heading. Opinions she would soon act on without permission. The tests had begun. And already they were slipping out of Eleanor's control. The second test was designed to look like an accident of fate, a stranger, down on his luck, needing help that would cost the helper something real. He wasn't a real stranger, of course. Eleanor had hired him, a struggling actor named Curtis who badly needed the $500 fee and asked very few questions about why a wealthy old woman wanted him to fake a declined credit card in front of 2 specific people. Eleanor gave him a script, a location, and a story. An elderly mother, urgent medication, a card that wouldn't work. He approached Mara first, outside a pharmacy 3 blocks from the hospice, on a night when her bank account held exactly $61 until her next paycheck, money that was supposed to cover her share of the rent. Mara paid for the medication without a second thought. $61 gone, in exchange for nothing but a stranger's shaky thank you. She walked home that night doing math in her head, trying to figure out which bill she'd be late on now, and she did not regret it for 1 second. That was the part that would have devastated her. Had she known someone was watching and grading the moment, she never once considered not helping. It simply wasn't a decision she weighed. It was just what you did. Derek's version happened 4 days later, at a different pharmacy, with the same actor and the same script. Derek's response was different in a way that revealed more than Eleanor had expected. He offered to look into resources for the man, a vague, costless promise he had no intention of keeping, and then, before walking away, took out his phone and filmed a 30-second clip of the interaction for his social media, capturing his own generosity from a flattering angle before the man had even finished thanking him. That clip reached 4,000 likes within a day. It also reached Eleanor's phone, forwarded by a cousin in the family group chat with the caption, "So proud of Derek." Eleanor stared at the video for a long time. For the first time in the entire experiment, she did not feel like a clinical observer running a controlled test. She felt like a mother watching her son perform kindness for an audience and mean none of it. That same week, something happened that Eleanor had not planned and could not have predicted. Curtis, the actor, uncomfortable with how real Mara's kindness had felt against how fake his own performance was, broke character slightly during their interaction, thanking her with an intensity that didn't match the transaction, an intensity that stayed with Mara afterward as a small, nagging wrongness she couldn't name. Something was off about him, she told a coworker the next day, unable to explain why. And in the background, another thread was quietly beginning to unravel. Ruth, moved by watching Mara pay her last $61 for a stranger, and then walk home worried about rent, did something Eleanor never authorized. She anonymously deposited $200 into Mara's account to cover the shortfall, transferred through an account not linked to Eleanor's name. It was a small act of mercy that broke every rule of the experiment. Eleanor didn't find out for weeks. When she did, it would raise a question she hadn't prepared for. If the people around her kept quietly interfering with her tests out of their own conscience, how could she trust that anything she was learning was still real? Meanwhile, Derek's viral pharmacy video had traveled further than any of them expected, all the way to a local journalist named Sam Okafor, who was working on an unrelated gentle feature story about the charitable reputation of prominent local families. Sam watched the clip twice, noted something faintly performative about it that professional instinct wouldn't let her ignore, and opened a blank document on her laptop titled, simply, Voss, Follow-up. None of them knew it yet, but two separate investigations, one run by a dying mother with a hidden camera, and one about to be run by a journalist with nothing but curiosity, were now on a collision course. By the fourth month, Eleanor's tests had grown more dangerous, not to Derek and Mara's bodies, but to something harder to repair, their trust. She designed a test with no camera and no possible reward. The purest version of the experiment she knew how to build, disguised in a wig and a wheelchair, posing as a random patient in the ward next to her own real room, a deception maintained with the help of two hospital staff members she'd quietly compensated. Eleanor asked Mara for a late-night favor near the end of a 14-hour shift, simply, "Please, don't leave me alone tonight. I'm afraid." Mara stayed an extra unpaid hour. She held the disguised woman's hand and talked to her about nothing in particular, her mother's garden, a television show, anything to fill the silence. Because the woman said she was afraid of dying alone, and Mara had decided a long time ago that no one should have to be afraid of that if she could help it. By pure accident, a security camera meant for the neighboring room caught the entire hour on tape. Nobody had planned it. It would turn out to be the single most important piece of footage in the entire year. Proof, later, of something no stage test could have manufactured, because Mara had no idea anyone would ever see it. Derek's version of the same test, that same week, was smaller in scope and larger in consequence. Hospital staff, following Eleanor's arrangement, asked him to visit a lonely patient for 20 minutes, an actual elderly patient, not a plant, someone with no family who genuinely wanted company. Derek canceled twice. When he finally showed up, he spent almost the entire visit on his phone. Still in disguise from the next bed, Eleanor asked him directly, "Do you think anyone's watching you right now?" "No," Derek said, and visibly relaxed, his shoulders dropping, his attention returning fully to his phone. Settling into an openly dismissive rudeness he would never have shown in front of a single witness who mattered to him. It was, in its quiet way, the most devastating moment of the entire experiment so far. Eleanor removed her wig in the parking lot that night and sat in her car for 11 minutes before she could make herself drive home. Walking to that car for the first time, her legs had genuinely failed her for a few seconds, a private, frightening reminder that whatever time she thought she had left to finish this audit of her own family, she likely had far less. The tests were no longer just measuring Derek and Mara, they were racing a clock only Eleanor could hear ticking, and the variables were multiplying. Mara, sharp enough to notice patterns even exhausted, began to sense that too many strangers were needing help in her orbit lately, a wallet, a pharmacy, a lonely stranger in a hospital bed. What had felt like ordinary bad luck for others started to feel, to her, less like coincidence and more like being watched. She confronted Ruth directly, asking if something strange was going on. Ruth denied it so unconvincingly that Mara walked away more certain than ever that someone, somewhere, was pulling invisible strings around her life. Derek, separately, received an anonymous tip, sent by Ruth, without Eleanor's knowledge or permission, informing him plainly, "Your aunt is testing people for the will." It should be corrected here that Derek was, by the family record, Eleanor's son, though the tip Ruth sent referred to her carelessly as your aunt, a small mistake in a text sent in a rush of guilty conscience. The mistake didn't matter, the information did. Overnight, Derek stopped being an unknowing subject and became a knowing one. And a knowing subject, Eleanor would soon discover, was a far more dangerous thing to test than an unknowing one. Everything changed the week Mara decided she was done wondering and started demanding answers. She found Eleanor alone in her hospital room. Not disguised this time, but wearing her own name on her wristband, the one Mara had somehow never fully registered before, because who reads a wristband on a woman you've talked to 100 times? "Is it true?" Mara asked, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, exhausted in a way that went deeper than the 12-hour shift she'd just finished. "Is somebody testing me? Is this whole thing, the wallet, the pharmacy, all of it, some kind of game?" Eleanor Voss, forensic accountant, widow, mother, billionaire, looked her night shift aide directly in the eye and lied. "No," she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." It was, without question, the most morally compromised thing Eleanor did in the entire experiment. And it cracked something in the audience's understanding of her, if there had been an audience watching in real time. She was no longer simply the wise, wounded judge running a clean test on two flawed people. She was, herself, capable of deceiving someone who trusted her, in the exact moment that person deserved the truth most. Mara left the room believing she had imagined the whole thing. She would not learn the real answer for months, but something else was cracking open at the same time, on a different floor of the story entirely. Priya Chen, auditing an unrelated account as part of routine estate work, discovered that Derek had quietly withdrawn a significant sum from a joint account he shared with his own mother, Eleanor herself, without her knowledge, to fund a very public, very photographed donation to the hospice. He had staged his own spontaneous act of charity and paid for it, invisibly, with money that was never really his to spend. It was the exact shape of the betrayal that had once cost Eleanor and Walter Voss a fortune 4 decades earlier, a loyal family member quietly moving money in the dark while performing loyalty in the light. Priya recognized the pattern immediately, and it chilled her. She now sat on information she was, in some legal and moral sense, obligated to disclose. But to whom? Eleanor, who was fading fast and might not survive the shock, or Derek, who would certainly deny it? Priya said nothing yet. She simply began keeping better notes. It was in this same period that Eleanor, rattled by how close her own experiment was coming to falling apart, made her first, true strategic error. Sensing a journalist, Sam Okafor, circling closer to the family with uncomfortable questions about the Voss name, Eleanor agreed to a sit-down interview meant to control the narrative before it spiraled. During that interview, Sam mentioned, almost in passing, that hospital records showed unusual camera access requests filed under Eleanor's name over the past several months. Eleanor's face, for one unguarded second, betrayed her completely. The audit was no longer contained. It had leaked past the walls Eleanor had built around it, into the hands of a professional who knew exactly what an inconsistency looked like, because that instinct, more than anything, was the one thing Eleanor Voss and Sam Okafor had in common. Everything that had been simmering for months now boiled over at once. Sam Okafor's instincts, sharpened by that flicker of fear on Eleanor's face, pulled her further into the story than she'd originally intended. She began looking beyond the wallet and the pharmacy video, and found something that had nothing to do with Eleanor's tests at all. Derek's mounting personal debts, and the joint account he'd drained without his mother's consent. At the same time, Eleanor, rattled and increasingly desperate to protect the footage that told the true story of the year, asked Priya to handle the security recordings discreetly before they could become a liability. It was a request born from fear, not malice. But Priya recognized instantly what it actually was: a request to interfere with evidence. Priya refused. It was the first time anyone inside Eleanor's carefully controlled operation had said no to her directly, and it fractured something between them. Eleanor, for the first time in the entire year, had no idea whether the person she trusted most with the truth was still fully on her side. Derek, meanwhile, having learned weeks earlier that he was being tested, began performing with increasing desperation, cornered by rumors he could feel building around him. Rumors about debt, about his mother's failing health, about a will that might not favor him the way he'd always assumed. He staged one final, elaborate act of generosity, funding a full renovation of a wing at Riverside Hospice, publicly announced, heavily photographed, paid for with a loan he could not realistically repay. It was meant to be his masterstroke. Instead, it became the cruelest irony of the entire story, because within days, Eleanor's own condition worsened to the point that she was moved into hospice care herself, placed by simple bureaucratic coincidence into the very wing her son was publicly claiming credit for saving. The family did not yet register the irony. The audience, and soon everyone in that memorial reception room, eventually would. It was in this same wing, working her actual shift, that Mara Delgado was finally assigned as Eleanor's real aide. No disguise, no fabricated identity, for the first time in the entire experiment. Standing at the foot of the bed, reading the chart, seeing the full name for the first time, Eleanor Voss, Mara finally understood. Every strange coincidence of the past several months collapsed into a single, furious realization. The wallet, the pharmacy, the stranger asking her not to leave her alone at night. All of it had been this woman. All of it had been a test, and Mara had never once consented to being part of it. She confronted Eleanor that night, voice shaking with an anger she rarely let herself feel. "You used me," Mara said. "For months. I trusted you. I sat with you because I thought you were scared and alone. And the whole time you were... what, grading me?" It was the emotional low point of the entire story, the moment the audience, and Mara herself, briefly turned against the very woman who had been about to reward her with more than she could imagine. Eleanor, out of time, out of strength, and finally out of the will to keep lying, did the only thing left to do. She told Mara everything. The truth came out in pieces, the way it always does when someone has spent a lifetime protecting it. Eleanor told Mara about Walter, about Robert, the cousin who cried loudest at the funeral and stole quietest in the years after, about the ledgers she'd taught herself to read line by line, looking for the one number that didn't match, and about how that skill had become, over 4 decades, the only language she trusted anymore. "I didn't test you to catch you being bad," Eleanor said, her voice thin, threaded through with the effort it now took just to speak. "I tested you to see who you were when you thought it didn't matter. I did the same thing to my son. I am so sorry it cost you money you couldn't afford to lose, and a friendship at work, and a job you nearly lost for doing the right thing when a coworker was stealing, and you were the only one who said something." Mara sat very still, absorbing all of it. The wallet, the pharmacy, the unlocked drawer of staff wages she'd been left alone with weeks earlier at Eleanor's actual home, cash she had counted and corrected downward to exactly what she was owed, never noticing the camera in the corner of that room, never imagining anyone was watching, doing the right thing purely because it was right. While this conversation was happening in a hospice room, in a lawyer's office across the city, Priya Chen made a decision of her own, legally bound to protect Eleanor's current unsigned intentions rather than any earlier draft of the will. Priya began quietly assembling every piece of evidence the year had generated: the accidental security footage from that first late-night favor, the pharmacy video, the bank records Sam Okafor had independently uncovered, and, most importantly, footage from Eleanor's own home, capturing the moment Mara corrected the drawer of cash in her own favor downward, instead of taking what wasn't hers. Priya also discovered something Eleanor had never told anyone, not even Priya herself. A locked file in Eleanor's home office labeled with the name of Priya's own late husband. It would take Priya weeks to understand why, but the discovery cracked open something enormous. Eleanor's tests, it turned out, had never been purely administrative or purely about Derek and Mara. They were personal, in ways that reached further into the people around her than anyone yet realized. Sam Okafor's investigation, running on its own separate track, finally published. Not the story of Eleanor's elaborate tests, which Sam still did not fully understand, but the story of Derek's mounting debts, and the joint account he had drained from his own mother without her consent. It was a devastating public embarrassment, arriving at the worst possible moment, days before Eleanor's health took its final, sudden turn. Cornered by the exposure, and by the growing certainty that his mother might die before finalizing any updated will, Derek made the single worst decision of his life. He went to Priya and tried to pressure her into pushing through an older draft of the estate, one written years earlier, before any of the testing had begun, one that favored him completely and made no mention of Mara Delgado at all. "She's not going to wake up again," Derek told Priya, his voice low and urgent in her office. "You know that. The old will is still legally valid, just process it. Nobody needs to know about any of this." Priya looked at him for a long moment. "I know exactly what's legally valid," she said. "And it isn't that." Eleanor Voss woke once more. It was not expected. Her doctors had told the family to prepare for the end days earlier, and yet on a quiet Thursday evening, with Mara sitting beside her, not on shift, not being paid, simply there because she had chosen to stay through the night with no will, no money, and no audience, the purest and most unwatched act of the entire year, caught only by a hallway camera nobody had thought to check. Eleanor's eyes opened. She learned, in the space of a few whispered minutes, exactly what her son had tried to do while she was unconscious, and exactly what Mara had done instead. What happened next took place in front of Priya and a hospital witness, deliberate and clear-eyed enough to close any legal ambiguity forever. Eleanor Voss, in her own voice, updated her final instructions. 2 days later, she died. The public reveal that followed was nothing like the dramatic scene a lesser story might have promised. There was no courtroom, no shouting, just a conference room at the Voss Group headquarters. Family and hospice staff gathered quietly, the same room where, weeks earlier, no one could have imagined the truth that was about to surface. Priya stood at the head of the table with her laptop open. Eleanor left very specific instructions, she said. She wanted everyone here to see this before the will was read. Not to punish anyone, her words, to help everyone understand why. The footage played in order, the wallet on the cafeteria table and Derek's hand slipping 2 20s into his own pocket. The pharmacy, and Mara's last $61 disappearing into a stranger's hand without a flicker of hesitation, followed by Derek's phone rising to film his own generosity from a flattering angle. The unplanned hour, caught by a camera meant for another room, of Mara sitting through the night with a woman she believed was a frightened stranger. The unlocked drawer of cash at Eleanor's home, and Mara's hands counting it twice, correcting the total downward, taking only what she was owed. And then, the final piece, recorded that same week, quietly, by Priya's own request, in Priya's office. Derek's voice, low and certain, telling her that his mother was not going to wake up again, that the old will was still valid, that nobody needed to know. The room was silent in a way rooms rarely are. Derek sat very still, his face doing something none of the assembled family had ever seen it do before. Not performing, not managing an audience. Simply and completely exposed. "You knew," Derek said finally, his voice cracking, directed at Priya. Though everyone understood he was really speaking to the woman in the photograph on the easel by the window. "This whole time, you knew, and you let me—" "I let you make your own choices," Priya said quietly. "That was always the point. Nobody forced you to take the finder's fee out of that wallet. Nobody forced you to film yourself instead of actually helping that man. Nobody forced you to come into my office and ask me to push through an old will while your mother was still breathing. Every single thing on that footage, you chose." Derek turned to Mara, who was sitting near the back of the room, still in her work clothes, having come straight from a shift she almost hadn't been allowed to leave for this. "You knew too," he said. "The whole time you were in this house. You could have told me." "I found out the same week you did," Mara said, and her voice, though tired, did not waver. The difference is, once I knew, I didn't try to use it to get anything, I just kept showing up. That's it. That's the whole difference between us, Derek. I kept showing up when nobody was checking. It was not a cruel thing to say. It was, if anything, said with something closer to sadness than triumph. The sadness of a woman who had never asked to be part of any of this, and who understood more clearly than anyone else in the room exactly how much it must have cost Eleanor to build an entire final year of her life around finding out the truth about the people she loved. Derek put his face in his hands. Whatever he said next, and he did say something, quiet and broken, an apology that came out tangled and imperfect, the way real apologies almost always do, mattered less than the fact that for the first time in the story, nobody in that room was watching him perform. He wasn't crying for a camera, there wasn't one on. He was simply a man confronting for the first time without an audience to manage, exactly who he had chosen to be when he thought it didn't matter. Priya let the silence sit before she spoke again. "There's one more thing," she said. "A letter. Eleanor wanted it read after the footage, not before." She opened the second document. Priya read Eleanor's final letter aloud, and the room listened the way rooms listen when they finally understand what an entire year has actually been about. "I didn't test you to catch you being bad," the letter began. "I tested you to see who you were when you thought it didn't matter. Derek, I loved you before I started watching, and I love you still. But I built this house once with a man who thought kindness performed was the same as kindness lived. And I will not build it again." The will that followed was not the fairy tale windfall Mara had never once expected or asked for. Controlling interest in the estate went to her, but it came earmarked, deliberately and specifically, to properly fund the hospice wing renovation Derek had once tried to claim credit for while quietly draining his mother's account to pay for it. The irony, finally, landed exactly where Eleanor had intended it to. Derek was not disinherited entirely. Eleanor had made clear, in her own hand, that this was never about punishment. He received a smaller, carefully structured trust, attached to a single condition: quarterly meetings with Priya, reviewing his finances, an inheritance shaped like accountability instead of either reward or punishment. It was, in its own way, the most honest gift Eleanor had ever given her son. Not money without consequence, and not abandonment, but a structure designed to help him become, slowly, the man she had always hoped he could be. The consequences did not stop at the will. Sam Okafor's earlier reporting on Derek's debts had already become public knowledge, and in the weeks that followed the reading of the will, the fuller story, the tests, the footage, the pharmacy video he'd filmed for likes while a stranger stood forgotten beside him, became public too. Told not out of cruelty, but because Eleanor's own final wish demanded that everyone, including Derek, finally understand why. Derek lost the polished public image he had spent a decade building. He lost the easy assumption held by everyone who knew him that generosity performed in public was the same thing as generosity lived in private. What he did not lose, because his mother had specifically deliberately made sure of it, was the chance to actually change, under real accountability, with real consequences attached to real choices, instead of simply inheriting a fortune and continuing exactly as he was. It was not the kind of justice that feels like fireworks. It was the kind of justice that feels, instead, like a long overdue correction finally entered into a ledger that had been wrong for a very long time, precise, earned, and entirely deserved. Months later, Sam Okafor sat across from Mara Delgado on camera, now covering the story properly, no longer chasing a puff piece but telling the real one. "Do you feel like you won something?" Sam asked. Mara thought about it for a long moment, about the 11 years of night shifts, the leak above her stove that still wasn't fixed, the nursing degree folded up small enough not to look at very often, the $61 she'd handed a stranger without a second thought, the hours she'd stayed with a frightened old woman who turned out to be one of the wealthiest people in the city. "That's the only part of any of it I'm still glad about. I wasn't performing for anyone, I was just being myself, and it turns out that was enough." The hospice wing renovation was finished that spring, fully funded, no plaque with anyone's name on it, exactly as Eleanor had specified in her final instructions. Mara still worked there. Though not the overnight shift anymore, and not for $2.50 more an hour out of desperation. She trained new aides now, and one of the first things she told every single one of them, without fully explaining why, was this: do the right thing even when nobody's checking. Someone might be, and it might matter more than you'll ever know. But even if nobody is, it's still who you are. Derek Voss, quarterly meeting by quarterly meeting, slowly became someone closer to the man his mother had once hoped for. It did not happen overnight, and it was not a clean cinematic transformation. There were setbacks. There were meetings with Priya where the old defensiveness crept back in. But there were also, increasingly, small unwitnessed moments. A returned overpayment nobody would have noticed was missing. A quiet visit to a lonely patient with his phone left in the car that suggested something in him had genuinely begun to shift. Not because a camera was watching, but because he had finally understood, in the most painful way possible, that someone always eventually is. At the very end of Eleanor's letter, after the accounting of tests and consequences and structured trusts, there was one final line that Priya almost hadn't read aloud, because it felt too private for the room. She read it anyway, because Eleanor had asked her to. I spent my whole life afraid of being fooled again. I want you all to know something before I go. I wasn't fooled by Mara. Not once. Some people are simply who they say they are, all the way down, even when no one is grading them for it. If you ever find someone like that in your life, trust them completely. I only wish I had learned to do that sooner, instead of learning at last, from a woman who never once asked me to. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Outside, the city kept moving the way it always does, indifferent to grief and to justice and to every quiet test a person runs before they're finally ready to let go. But inside that room, something had genuinely settled, not the loud, triumphant kind of ending a lesser story might have promised, but a smaller, truer one. A family, broken and rebuilt in the space of a single, terrible, illuminating year, finally understanding that the truest measure of a person was never what they did when everyone was watching. It was what they did when they were sure no one was.
Moral of the story: true character is revealed not by what we do when others are watching, but by the choices we make when no one is looking. Wealth, reputation, and public praise can create the illusion of goodness, but genuine integrity comes from honesty, compassion, and selflessness that require no audience or reward. Mara never knew she was being tested, yet she consistently chose kindness, returned what did not belong to her, sacrificed her own comfort to help strangers, and treated every person with dignity. Her actions proved that real goodness is a habit of the heart, not a performance for recognition. In contrast, Derek cared more about appearances than principles, believing that public acts of generosity could hide private dishonesty. His mistakes showed that deception and selfishness eventually come to light, no matter how carefully they are concealed. Eleanor's final lesson reminds us that trust should be earned through consistent actions, not impressive words. The greatest legacy we can leave is not money or success, but a life built on integrity, humility, accountability, and genuine compassion. When we choose to do the right thing simply because it is right, we become the kind of person others can truly trust. And that is a far more valuable inheritance than any fortune.